I'm excited about this panel, which is views from the field. So a chance for us to hear about how things are going and where folks that actually have to implement this new law, how they feel about challenges and opportunities. And so we've got a panel that's sort of structured with, we're going to actually start with Dave Gutierrez to give a little bit of I guess help interpret this thing for us, and how things are going, and then you'll go right into sort of your views from the state perspective on challenges and opportunities, and then we're going to go sort of from north to south, and the theory being we're starting with the easy stuff, Thad, right? Up in the Sacramento Valley where they got lots of groundwater, and then we move into the sort of, Walter's going to talk a bit about sort of San Joaquin River region issues where things have been heating up, and then we're going to go to the toughest, at least in my view. Maybe you'll get me to revise my views on which is harder and which is easiest. But Eric, who's down in Tulare Basin, and hear from them, and then have a chance to pepper them with questions. So, Dave, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, so I know a lot of familiar faces in here, and I know a lot of you are very familiar with Sigma, but I also know there's some folks from out of state here. So I thought we'd start off by giving you just a little bit of overview and kind of how we got to where we got, and maybe some key terms, and then we'll kind of go from there. So groundwater, I think you've heard in some of the previous presentations, is absolutely critical to the success and the economics of California. When you look at statewide, groundwater is used on a normal year, 30–40% statewide. On a drought year, that number goes up to over 60%. When you look around the states, there's some areas that actually completely depend on groundwater. Now the problem is, over the last 100 years, we've gotten ourselves into trouble on certain and particular areas in the state. So we've seen these adverse conditions, and it's kind of important to understand these adverse conditions. So you look along the coast, you see some saltwater, seawater intrusion. You look in the Central Valley, both in the north and the south, you see some subsidence going on. You certainly see water levels dropping, and obviously the loss of water volume as well. And then there's the stream water, groundwater interaction. So you see some of the problems that I think have been associated with that over the last several decades. So now these adverse impacts are really what's, I think, what has resulted in SGMA, which was passed in 2014. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, I think there's a couple of key principles. And one of the biggest principles that I think the legislation intended, and certainly the Department of Water Resources has moved forward with this principle kept in mind, is that groundwater is best managed at the local level. And so you'll see everything that we're putting together, and I think everything that's going to move forward is with that key principle in mind. So we got to keep that in mind, that it's going to be managed at the local level, and that's how we're going to try to design this particular law. Now, this particular law applies to all alluvial basins in the state of California. And the Department of Water Resources had previously defined basins, and these basins have been changing for the last several decades. And it landed last January 2015, it landed on 515 basins throughout the state. Now, another key important item on that is, although there's 515 basins, there's what's called high, medium, low, and very low priority basins. So it's these priority basins that are kind of a key. And some folks have a little bit misunderstanding of what the priority of a basin is. And we've had to communicate this over and over again. But the priority, the best way to look at it is it's the importance of the basin, not necessarily the condition. So there's various factors, but if it's an important basin, if it's important to the community, if the community depends on that groundwater, that's what's going to be a high or medium priority basin. And that's really critical because there's, out of those 515 basins statewide, there's 127 that are high and medium priority. And I focus on that because it's the high and medium priority basins that SGMA actually is, those basins are required to follow SGMA. The low and very low priority basins, they're more on a voluntary basis. So those priorities are really critical to understand. Now, I talked a little bit about the impacts that we've been having around the state, And I think it's important to understand those impacts. Those impacts have turned into what's called undesirable results outlined in Sigma. And so you can think of Sigma as going to be designed around avoiding the undesirable results. So we're not necessarily, I mean, it's going to get to it. It's going to be getting to looking at water levels and so on and so forth. But it's all about these undesirable results. So those exact impacts that I talked about, seawater intrusion, subsidence, water levels, those have now been defined in Sigma as undesirable results. And if we can avoid those undesirable results, then you're going to be successful. Now, there are some vague terms in the legislation. So it says we need to avoid undesirable results that are significant and unreasonable. And then, of course, what's that mean? What's significant and unreasonable? So it's going to be up to the locals with the Department of Water Resources kind of looking over their shoulder to work with the stakeholders to define what is significant and unreasonable. And you can imagine this is really the only way that the legislation was going to be able to be crafted because of the various conditions throughout the state. We can't compare what's happening up in the north with what's happening down in the south. You can't necessarily put a number on what's a significant and unreasonable subsidence number, or what's a significant and unreasonable drop in water level. So that's really important to understand. So there's a couple of different entities that have the responsibility to put forward Sigma. So again, the first is the local agencies. So the local agencies, you've heard the term GSA, that's the Groundwater Sustainability Agencies. And these are the agencies of the future that will be actually managing groundwater. And these are local agencies. So the way that Sigma defines these agencies is you must be a public agency, and you must have responsibilities in either water or land use. If you have that, you can volunteer to be a groundwater sustainability agency within your basin. Now, as you can imagine, there's various agencies that actually fit that definition. And so these agencies are going to have to work together and coordinate and cooperate to figure out how they're going to govern those particular basins. So the Sigma was given many authorities and responsibilities associated with those new groundwater sustainability agencies. So it's going to be up to them to figure out how to govern, take those responsibilities and authorities, then implement their local groundwater management. Then the other two key responsibilities lie with my department, the Department of Water Resources, and then the State Water Resource Control Board. So my department really falls into two categories. One, we were responsible for writing the rules of the game. And those rules of the game are really two sets of regulations. The first was basin boundary modifications. So when you look at the way that the state, the department had originally set up these particular basins, we set them up both from a scientific basis and also from a jurisdictional basis. So from a scientific, what's the edges of the alluvium? That would be the scientific basis of defining a particular basin. But in California, look at the entire Central Valley. The entire Central Valley of California is huge. It's one big, gigantic basin. You can't really manage that one basin all on its own. So it was broken up into these jurisdictions pre-Sigma. Now, Sigma comes along, and there may be better ways to actually manage those basins in the future. And so regulations had to be developed to allow those locals to provide some possibilities of potentially changing those basin boundaries. So the basin boundary regulations were completed back last year. They're implemented. We had our first window open between January and March of this year for those local agencies to actually apply to change those particular basin boundaries. And then the next set of regulation is actually the most critical one, and that's the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulation. So the GSP, or the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, that's going to be the key. That's the key of how that local agency's going to manage water into the future. And so you could imagine, again, the Department of Water Resources had to lay out how a groundwater sustainability plan is going to be developed, and then most importantly, how is the department going to evaluate whether that groundwater sustainability plan is going to be adequate or not. And then following up over the next course of decades to follow, are they actually implementing that groundwater sustainability plan in an adequate manner? So it's going to be up to the department to be working with these local agencies, starting actually right now as we move forward into this particular, putting this piece of legislation together. And then the last piece is the State Water Resource Control Board. The State Water Resource Control Board has a critical role as well in SGMA. And so their role has often been defined as kind of the backstop. So again, local agencies, we're giving them the responsibility to manage groundwater. But if they're not able to do that, if they're not able to form a governance structure by June of 2017, if they're not able to develop a groundwater sustainability plan by either 2020, if you're already in an overdraft condition, or 2022, if not, if you're not able to develop that plan, then that's another backstop situation. Or if you're not actually able to manage according to your plan, yet another backstop. And what I mean by backstop, if the locals don't meet those criteria, then the state water resources can come in and internally manage the basin for the locals. They will come in, so it's not a voluntary thing. So that's what we're trying to avoid. We want the locals to be successful. We all think that's the best way to manage this, and so that's what we're going to try to achieve. Now, of course, the department's been already engaged in this. We had, when you look at this this map that was, this little graph that was sent out to you, passed around, you look at the little orange boxes, and the orange boxes are the one that the Department of Water Resources were responsible for. So we've been pretty busy up front. We had the most responsibilities up front in the act, and we've kind of been knocking them down. We've certainly been on schedule to do that. Certainly up front was the development of the regulations. Some of the other things that we've had to do is to define which basins are in critical condition of overdraft. And then after that, we have the regulations. We provided facilitation. Some of the other things, you just heard about water available free charge, so the department's going to be doing that. Some of the issues that I see, and then I'll close up. First and foremost is GSA formation. Will these GSAs be able to actually get the governance structure up and running? The next big issue is data. This is certainly a tough issue to deal with, and we need to get good and accurate data and develop the data gaps in order to get to the right answers. That's going to be a huge lift on all of our parts. And then, of course, the communication and outreach is critical. We want to actually work on the correct types of information. Sometimes that is, you're working with truths, and sometimes you're not. And then finally, the tough decisions of actually balancing the supply and demand that it's going to go with the local agencies. So that's some of the issues I see up front, and I'll kind of close there and pass it on.
Thank you. I think we'll pass right over to Thad.
Good afternoon. My name is Thad Bettner. I'm the general manager at Glen Cluse Irrigation District. We're up in the northern part of the Sacramento Valley, about 80 miles north of Sacramento. Our district's about 175,000 acres. We grow all kinds of crops. We serve 3 refuges, and a lot of the work we actually do is coordination with the environment. I spend probably more of my time serving the environment in terms of what our district can do than actually serving our growers. So it's a unique situation we have in Northern California. It makes it, I'm an engineer, so trying to be a biologist, it's always a fun night job, I guess. I guess just to maybe give you a short history of kind of where we've been and then where we think we're going was kind of what I want to talk about today. First, just in our region, if you do go to David's website and you look at the groundwater entities that formed, we kind of have an interesting story in Northern California. When the SGMA legislation was passed, we had some small districts, kind of the 5 to 10,000 acre range, decided that they wanted to be a GSA. And we were kind of all trying to hold back and say, wait, let's kind of get our story figured out, who's going to do what, and then let's everybody go form our GSA per the legislation. There was some concern about the counties and what role the counties would have, so they decided just to act and filed to be a GSA. And under the legislation, when it was passed at the time, you had 90 days to, if you had an overlapping area or somebody was going to control the area you were interested in, you had to also file. And so what happened was those districts filed, and then 90 days later, the county filed. And then when the county filed, the other districts had to file, then we had to file, and then we're in 2 counties. So when we filed, then the other county had to file, and then all the entities in that county had to file. So pretty soon we had, attorneys and everybody going squirrely for about 6 months trying to file and get everything done per legislation. So if you look in our area, it's just a complete mess. And then a year later, they passed new legislation and said, well, if you're all overlapping, you all got to start over, so good luck with that. So we're starting over, so that's kind of where we ended up. So that's kind of the story, and I think so it's kind of rough going, and memories are short, which is a good thing. Maybe just start with some key issues, and then maybe our path forward. I think in our area, I think you've heard before. I mean, we are blessed with a lot of the precipitation in Northern California, so that is a good thing, and does make, I would say, our life a little bit easier than what Eric's probably going to talk about. But nonetheless, we do have some problems up in the Sacramento Valley. We have areas where we do have subsidence in different local regions. We have area with extreme overdraft, and I would say that likely that area of overdraft will not be solved with surface water. There's going to have to be likely some demand reduction as part of the solution, and that's always challenging. And I would say the bigger issue in our area deals with connected surface and groundwater and how that affects stream, river flows, and the ecosystem services that we provide. So to what extent does groundwater recharge that we do ultimately end up in streams to the benefit of fish and other species, and to what extent does groundwater pumping deplete some of those streams and cause environmental impacts? And I think that will be a very rough issue to work through, given that we don't have a lot of data. It's easy to go in there and do water balances, water budgets, supply, demand, surface water, imported water, et cetera. But once you bring in the environment and how you affect the environment, you need a different tool set, and that will be a challenge, but one that we're looking forward to. So how we're moving forward, I think, involves a couple things. First, as David indicated, the department's providing facilitation services. So in both of our counties, like I said, we're fortunate to be in 2 counties, and we're fortunate to do this twice. So we're doing 2 different efforts in 2 different counties. And we're trying to, as a district, we're trying to bring those counties into alignment. They want to act independent and do separate processes with separate outcomes, potentially separate governance structures, and we're trying to kind of wrangle them in and say, wait a second, you really need to work together and have similar structures if this is going to work. So we're trying to do that. So through David and his mechanisms, we have facilitation services in both counties. It's the same facilitator, which is good news, so hopefully that will bring some traction to bring some closure on that. As you know, groundwater is not an environmental issue, it's a emotional issue. How about that? And I would say a lot of the discussions are functioning high on emotion and little with facts. And so one of the things we've tried to do with both of the counties and say is we need to bring in some water budgets into this discussion, so look at different parts of the county, surface water, groundwater, the environment, and say we just need some basic water budgets. Forget how the water moves at this point. We know it all moves. We'll figure out later. But let's use some simple budgets and figure out where we're doing well, where we're doing bad, because that will start to feed into what our governance structure looks like. So we told the counties, let's work on some water budgets. They said, great. If you guys pay for it, we'll do it. So we as surface water districts have actually given money to the counties to hire their own consultant to go and do the water budgets. But again, we need buy-in in the process, so we've agreed to do that. So that process is ongoing. So, we're hopeful as we move forward that type of data and information will better inform governance. And, as I like to say, if we meet one time a month, we had 12 meetings to go, but now we're starting in July. Now we have 11 meetings left to get our governance put together. So the pressure's on, but we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Walter, you have a slide, right?
Yeah, I just have one slide. I guess the first thing I want to say is, by the way, my name is Walter Ward. I work for Stanislaus County. I see by this card here that I've now created the Stanislaus County Water Resources District, so that's pretty thrilling. But first of all, I want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to come over here. Where we live over in the Central Valley is going to get up to about 40 to 41 degrees C today. So it's nice to be over here where it's only about 20 degrees C. Very refreshing. I put up this slide, and I use this a lot when I make these presentations, and it's kind of self-explanatory, right? And what I want to talk about, though, is the word awareness. And you can substitute that in this regard as opportunity. It's been a tremendous opportunity to bring together so many different institutions that in the past really had nothing to do with one another, only if they shared a common issue, right? And people generally don't get excited about anything unless they sense a risk or a reward, right? And what Sigma has done is raise this level of awareness and this concept of risk that many of these institutions that are now working across these boundaries, it's been fantastic. The county's role has been largely one of a collaborator and a facilitator, bringing people together. And again, every week I'm in 5 or 6 different places talking to groups of people that we have now established trust. And so a lot of the work that happens at the ground level is building the trust and sharing information, sharing education, educating them to what the issues are, spending a lot of time covering and keep coming back on that. Many of the institutions, and there's 9 cities in Stanislaus County, all of which are 100% dependent upon groundwater, except City Modesto gets about half of their supply from treated surface water. The public works departments and their staff are not geologists, so you've really got to go back to the geology to explain the occurrence and distribution and movement of groundwater. So you've got to constantly be working on the education that, in my mind, as a geologist, a hydrogeologist, begins with the most fundamental piece, and that's the geology. So working through those issues has been extremely valuable and important. The map that Ellen showed very early on, that showed the entire Central Valley and had these different colored basins. From about where Stanislaus County is south is Eric's area, and virtually every basin is in a critical condition of overdraft or designated as such. Virtually every basin north of Stanislaus County is either high or medium priority. Right in Stanislaus County, we've got 4 different groundwater basins. 2 are critical condition of overdraft, 2 are high priority. So we've got kind of a mixed bag. And it drives different timeframes, as David mentioned. These preparation of these groundwater sustainability plans have different deadlines. And they're not end games, they're beginning points. I mean, just to get to your GSP by 2020 for the critical basins or 2022 for the high and medium priority, that's just the beginning of true implementation toward long-term groundwater management and sustainability. I see Sigma as a generational handoff. It's really not for a lot of us in this room, for a few of the younger people for sure. But it's really a multi-generational handoff. It's building a framework for the future, a foundation that had we had that in place, we probably wouldn't have got to where we are. I think safely say that. As Thad mentioned, the idea of forming these GSAs, these groundwater sustainability agencies, in our area, my area, has had a bit of resistance. And what it comes down to is these institutions, irrigation districts, water districts, these cities, have been around a long time. They've been around 125, 150 years. Now, for some of y'all, wherever you're from, that might not be like a long time. In Western United States and California, 125 to 150 years of a water purveyor as an institution, it's a big deal. So they're very grounded in their history. They're very proud of their history. They have invested infrastructure. They have invested assets. They've got customers. They've got to protect their institution, right? So they look at Sigma and they say, how do I get out on the other side and my institution still lives? What am I going to have to give up? Remember the risk and reward? How do I retain and protect my independent decision-making authority, that the board and the people that I work for, my ratepayers, are protected and decisions aren't being made by somebody else, like Brexit, right? European Union, but we won't go there. But there's a lot of local politics, and so trying to hold everybody together has been a challenge, and again, an opportunity as well. So here's what we've got. We've got 4 different basins, part or all of which are underneath Stanislaus County. I'll talk about one that I think is sort of the model of Sigma, but I don't think it's going to play out yet. And that's the concept of one GSA for one basin, preparing and implementing one GSP. One groundwater sustainability agency over one groundwater basin, developing and implementing one groundwater sustainability plan. We have one in Stanislaus County that's following that model. The rest of the basins are into a mode of establishing multiple GSAs, which Sigma allows. I mean, Sigma is a framework, right? It's got to have the flexibility. One size won't fit all, and California is too diverse. Multiple GSAs for each of the pieces of the basins, but all of them are working toward developing a single integrated GSP for the entire basin. That's a good thing. That's where you have to get to. I like to say to people that, getting to the GSP is probably the easy part. It's the implementation and the governance, how you make decisions, how you fund it, how you determine fair and equitable representation on these new boards, if you will, with the GSAs. Most in our area are looking at formation of what are called JPAs, Joint Power Authorities in California law, that allows different institutions to create a new agency, a JPA, whatever name it's called. That agency would then be empowered with the authority to implement, all the provisions. And there's a lot of authority in Sigma for these GSAs. It's very wide and very deep, which scares some people. But just forming the JPAs right now is a bit of a struggle. Just people trying to talk about, let's see, we've controlled this many acres, we control this many acre feet, we ought to have 3 out of the 7 votes, and we ought to weight our vote, just to get appointment and representation to these boards, how you fund it. There's another process in California called Proposition 218. Whenever there's a land use based parcel assessment, you have to put it to a vote of the people. They can reject that by a 50% plus one simple majority. So if you come up with a funding mechanism, and I'm not sure if Sigma is exempt from 218 or not, it's a bit of a pickle, because the GSAs are given authority to create funds and fees and collect monies and many other things, but it could get all turned upside down when you plug in 218. Okay. I just want to say a couple more things. One more. The land use, water use nexus is huge. I see the land use authorities in communication with these GSAs and determining special areas of basins that would be held aside for maybe groundwater recharge, groundwater management zones, because the geology is different monitoring programs, different pumping controls, different measurements of extraction. But ultimately, tying the land use to the water use is huge in terms of future implementation, sustainability, and as the young man was asking earlier about the 8 Fresnos, how do you do that? So.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Avert. I'm the manager for Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District, one of about 25 water districts in Kern County. And I'm also the manager of what's called the Kern Groundwater Authority, which is one of the JPAs that Walt had just described, that was formed to kind of deal or address with issues associated with Sigma. I'll try and keep my comments short. There's many parallels or common issues that Thad and Walt touched on that are true in Kern County. Kern is the largest groundwater basin, I believe, of the 515, and we get one of the gold stars of critically overdrafted, which means that we have a long way to go to put together a plan. But we have been somewhat benefited by the fact that even before Sigma, the acronym, was on anybody's lips, we had actually begun working on groundwater issues in Kern County, recognizing that we did have some issues and we needed to start working together towards those. So I'm not going to cover any of the same areas that they touched on, but I will say that when the panel was first formed, I had one particular topic, but in the last 2 weeks my topic has changed, and I want to actually, and I apologize if my frustration comes out in my comments, but it's been touched on in a couple of different conversations over the last few months. And I want to say that it's very important, and Thad touched on emotion, that we distinguish what SGMA does and what it does not do. And what SGMA does is it mandates the management of groundwater to prevent undesirable results. What it does not do, which some people I think erroneously assume, is that it somehow gives you authority to take and manage surface water that may be contracted or assigned or the right of another. And so when we're talking about forming GSAs and preparing GSPs, water districts are very involved and they're very protective of their water supply portfolios and assets, rightly so. But we need to make sure that we understand that SGMA, just because I'm a GSA, let's say that my water district becomes a GSA and I cover an area that maybe is 5 water districts. I am not empowered to take their water supplies and manage them based on what I want. And I'm speaking specifically to land use planners. Because just because the county or the city says, well, I'm going to be a GSA, go for it, you do not get any of the surface water supplies that are contracted or assigned to anybody in the basin. And there's this very real misunderstanding that's driving a lot of these decisions. And I will share with you candidly, the County of Kern very recently took a position which was very different than where they had been, that they thought, well, we're going to be the GSA for the whole basin. And I got a smile on my face and I said, good. And I went to my board and I said, let's not oppose it. Let's let them do it, because they're going to manage this much groundwater and they will decide how it's allocated and how to calculate it. And I said, and I can continue being a water district and not have to do all this GSP stuff. But my board, concern over, well, they're going to be able to control this or this or this. There's a common misunderstanding on both sides of the aisle of what SGMA is and is not. And we need to make sure that we educate ourselves and the policy people who are making these decisions. Because I think, again, as Thad alluded to, there's an emotional drive of control. I want to make sure that my land use planning decisions are preserved. They absolutely are preserved. But just because you're a GSA in a city or a county does not mean that you somehow get to tell the water district or whoever has the water supply, well, I want this development to occur, so therefore you need to give. And likewise, just because you're a water district doesn't mean that you can stop or prevent development. That is just inconsistent with the concepts of SGMA. So I apologize if the frustration comes through. It was very different than what I was going to talk about. But I'm seeing this, and even though we're late in the process, I'm still kind of surprised that that misunderstanding exists or permeates the discussion. So.
Thank you. So rather than me ask questions, I have a few in my pocket in case you guys don't have questions for them, but I'm guessing you do. It's a great opportunity to ask the managers about things. So who wants to go first?
So following
There we
up
go.
on your comment, what's the solution? If you have overdraft, you need to control development in order to sort of balance the equation of what goes in and what's, the whole water balance of the basin. But you don't have the authority because you're saying it goes beyond land use planning. So what do you do in those cases?
Well, SGMA is very clear that the basin has to be managed, and creating a balanced supply is part of that. So every GSP will deal with that issue depending on what geographic region it covers. So that's a very different issue than a land use planning entity assuming that, well, because I'm a GSA and I now have this power, I can take the water supply from somebody else because I like development. Let's say I'm a land use planner and I want this factory to go in. If there's not enough groundwater in that particular area and or surface that's been allocated, that land use planning agency can't go over to another piece of land and say, well, I'm going to take their groundwater and do it. The plan has to be, I think it's a coordinated effort between land use planners and the GSAs, clearly, so that there's a common understanding. But that linkage hasn't been made. I think Walt touched on that, those two types of entities really need to coordinate.
I'm from Australia, so my question might be...
Go, Mike.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I'm from Australia, so my question might be not so relevant for everybody, but I'm interested in the connection between groundwater and surface water. So it sounds like they're being treated quite separately, and I just wondered what capacity there is in the planning process for them to consider conjunctive management or integration. So Australia spent 10 years doing groundwater plans, not paying attention to surface water, and then we're like, actually, we should do that. And so then we've spent the last decade trying to create integration.
Let me start off. First, no, that's not true that it's separate. So the sustainable, the groundwater management plan, the groundwater sustainability plan must in fact complete a water budget. And that water budget has to actually have a good understanding of how surface water and groundwater interact. And basically what we want to understand is what is the supply and the demand, and what is the supply in terms of both groundwater and surface water. And then what we're trying to do is avoid those undesirable results. Now after that, it's up to you to figure out how you want to do it. I think Eric's point is there are already water rights in place, and folks actually own certain surface water situations. That's not going to change, and Sigma did not intend that to change. The point is, groundwater is a piece of the equation, and what Sigma's trying to do is you can't just make up, if you need more supply, you can't just make it up if you don't have any groundwater supply left. You have to address it somehow. You can go out and get more surface water. You can deal with the demand piece of it, but in either case, you're going to have to deal with both. So they're definitely tied together. The regulations are absolutely tying those together, and so the point is the laws are different. You have a water rights law, and now you have a groundwater law, but they are tied together, absolutely.
I want to add something to that. Cameron, if you look at the individual well hydrographs in our area, you can pick out by their signature every drought period because there's groundwater decline, right? I mean, and you can see recovery when they're wetter again because now surface water is available. That is sustainability, right, by definition. You have these cycles. Sustainability doesn't mean status quo, doesn't mean flat. It means change over time that's managed through conjunctive use. And it takes surface water to manage groundwater. It takes groundwater to manage surface water. They're directly linked. And so understanding that and how those mechanisms work, and to Eric's point, protecting water rights is huge in California. What's different with groundwater is, other than a correlative right, depending upon how much land you own above it, it's a usufructuary right. It's a right to use but not cause harm. Everybody owns it, but yet nobody owns it. And so that's kind of a different kind of a concept when we have to couple that together with these other programs and practices and other institutions. That's why it's going to take some time. This is evolutionary in the sense that we get to 2020, 2022, we're not flipping on a light switch and we're sustainable. David's, to his credit and to the credit of his team, has come up with this concept of substantial compliance. You know, we're not all going to get there at the same rate. We're not all going to get there at the same time. We're going to get there on different glide slopes. And it's going to take another generation, I'm sure of it, to move it through. I mean, it's a change, as Thad also mentioned. All of this is about doing things differently than we have in the past.
So yeah, just, I mean, real specific, you know, in California, our surface water system is highly regulated. You know, we have the State Water Resources Control Board that can go in and basically make decisions to change how water is allocated, when it is, independent of, you know, what's in your water rights. So that's a unique system. Our groundwater system and the GSPs will not likely be that specific. And so, you know, one of the things we deal with in the Sacramento Valley is, I mean, we know, we believe, whatever, how about that? We think, right? I don't want to get myself in too hot water here. That, you know, some groundwater pumping is affecting a stream, let's say, right? We know that. Well, if there's a surface water diverter on that stream, he will get cut off before the pumper will get cut off, irrespective of time, when who was first or who was last. So the only way you fix that is through an adjudication, obviously, right? And I think that's kind of what you guys went through. And I think the question is going to be is, can we do that voluntarily through a GSA, GSB process, which would be much quicker, much less expensive, and get the environment what it needs much quicker. But that's going to be, you got to bring some people to the table who have not been tabled before. And I think that's going to be the challenge of how do you get them enough information to say, yeah, they're part of the problem, but they can be part of the solution. And I think that's what we're up against right now.
And I apologize. I probably should have put a definition of groundwater because, for example, my district imports water and recharges the aquifer, but we would not consider it, quote, groundwater as I was intending to define it. My definition of groundwater sometimes is called safe yield. It's basically the unappropriated water that contributes to the groundwater basin that isn't assigned or isn't somehow claimed by virtue of a state work permit or others. And so that's the little piece. And in Kern County, and I've tried to tell people, we're fighting over nothing. I mean, it's a very, very, very small number. And that's really what we have to deal with. We have to quantify it and allocate it. And that is what our Sigma process will be. And then we have to learn to live within the means of what surface supplies we have and what the safe yield of the basin or the groundwater is.
So I would love to just follow up on that point and kind of tie it back to the first session and the discussion of recharge, because I know all over the Central Valley, folks have been interested in recharge before Sigma, but the arrival of Sigma has, let's say, heightened interest in recharge to a degree probably not seen before. And I've also heard from some folks that they would like to start doing that kind of accounting, not waiting until far in the future for getting some of that accounting going. And so, you know, the example that Andy provided for Pacro is already a bit further along on the institutional side because it is a special act district and they got the accounting sort of more set up. So all you have to do is kind of that additional piece there on getting the science right and so on. So what just kind of across from the managers in the different areas, what are you seeing in your where you are in your region, and do you see opportunities for getting this part of it jump started in terms of creating incentives for recharge and keeping track of that when it's often not going to be native groundwater, right? It's going to be this added in surface water.
Yeah, again, speaking just from Kern County's perspective, we collectively across the entire basin are very active in groundwater replenishment. It's just a way of life for us. We're in a perennially short area, and so we've been doing that for decades. But that's a strategy. You know, the prior discussion was flooding of fields, and those are things that we just do second nature. It's very common in our area. My water district has well over 3,000 acres of land just set aside specifically for groundwater replenishment with berms and basins, and when it's wet we put in as much as we possibly can, and we also have systems in place to allow us to deliver high flow water to farmers to over irrigate their fields in order to capture the replenishment water, the over irrigation as groundwater recharge. So for us that's been an ongoing process and just a strategy that allows us to survive in a very arid climate.
Yeah, I think the examples in the previous panel were illustrative of what we're trying to do as well. I mean, I think as a district, we just do that. We'll buy additional water, bring it in, and recharge it. We do a lot of it actually through streams and creeks that we have in our district. So we take creeks that are typically run dry in the summer, and we put water down them just to get recharged, and that's a very effective way to get water in the ground. But a lot of times we're buying that water. So if you're buying that water at $80 or $100 an acre foot, you're putting in the ground, it's tough to have a pumper next door pump that out and get it for free. So, at some point, I think where we're going to end up is, everybody's going to get some rata amount of groundwater pumping like Era was talking about. Is it this much or is it that much? We'll have to figure that out. And if you're pumping more than what your allocation is, it's going to cost. And you're going to have to pay somebody else who's not pumping. I mean, we do this in surface water districts. We do this all the time. We take land out of production. We don't have enough. growers transfer surface water internally to get enough water to cover their crop based on their unit duty or the ET rate or what they flow out the meter. I mean, that's what we're going to have to do with groundwater as well. So we're going to have a market system that addresses that. So who's going to administer that? I mean, we do it in our district, and trying to get the counties to do that, I mean, that's going to be a super heavy lift. No offense, Walter.
Boy, there's a lot of different places to start with that. In Stanislaus County, first of all, you've got to have a place to do recharge. And so you've got to start with depth of water measurements, and they're fairly shallow. So it may mean that if we do, in fact, find areas through these GSPs where groundwater recharge would, in fact, be beneficial, and where that might occur, we may have to pull the water level down so that we create a cone where we have a place to put recharge water. Not everywhere is it's not a big old homogeneous isotropic bucket of sand out there. There are different types of aquifers. If most of your pumping is occurring from a semi-confined or a confined aquifer, surface recharge isn't going to be doing anything for you. So you might have to look at injection, which is very costly. You're not going to move a bunch of water into that space, but it is a mechanism. Stanislaus County has applied for a state grant with the State Water Resources Control Board. We're waiting any day to hear whether or not we've been successful. And that's to look across our county and prioritize up to 15 different sites that could be used for stormwater capture for purposes of groundwater recharge. And prioritizing those, scaling them, and then being in position to be able to go after some future project, funding to actually build something would be the next step. So how those local scale, local managed, locally operated stormwater capture for groundwater recharge, how those would all work, it will all have to be integrated, into the GSPs.
Down with the blue shirt.
I'm Philip Sean. So the SIGMA is everyone does their own thing locally. So everyone does their own thing locally. They form a GSA and whatnot. Graham talked about how we've had like 140 million acre feet of overdraft. And we know that we're in an overdraft situation pretty regularly in the state. So if we implement SIGMA, it means we either take land out of production or increase our supply or some combination of both. So if you want to increase your supply, we're able to grab the peaks off the flood flows, perhaps, and get something. But to really effectively do it, you're going to have to change how you manage the state surface and groundwater system. And so you'll have, there's a thought that you would go to where you're re-operating your reservoirs. And so if you start doing that, like if you start re-operating Shasta and all the other dams, then that becomes a state issue. And so how does the regional GSA deal with this more global state management of the state water?
So we're actually studying that, and that's part of one of the requirements that we have to do. So there's a couple of things. So we're studying the reservoir reoperation to figure out whether there's really available water if you do reoperate the system. And, again, that's not a silver bullet either. It's not like there's a whole bunch of water left if you reoperate these systems. And that study will be coming out. The other piece that we're going to be doing is similar to like what the previous panel was actually addressing, and that is that water that's available for recharge. And we've kind of got that into two categories. So when we talk about what's the water available, it doesn't really become available until you build a project, right? And so we're not going to be able to tell you, here's how much water we can actually have available. What we can say is here's how much water is in excess, and then here's the type of projects that you could capture to capture that excess. But remember, what we're not tying to this is the economic factor. In other words, if we could capture water once every 20 years, is it going to be economically viable to capture that water once every 20 years? That's going to be some pretty expensive water. So that's going to be yet another round to actually figure out, how much water can we actually capture, because the economics are an important piece to that puzzle.
So have you looked into like the climate change thing and your supply getting the whole shifting the curves and being out of sync and the whole
so
thing?
Climate change is a big factor, but remember, there's a lot of uncertainties in climate change as well, so you got to be careful with that as well. But absolutely, climate change is a factor that's being part of this, all of these studies.
Yeah, question.
So going forward, as we start to have to make groundwater allocations, what are your thoughts about how you're going to make those allocations to the people that want to use groundwater in your various districts? Because there's a lot of possible plans, and I just want to see what your thoughts are for what you guys are planning.
Sure. So we're actually starting those conversations, and I can't speak to, well, first of all, we have to quantify how much groundwater. When I say groundwater, again, I'm talking about that safe yield. I hope and assume that it'll be allocated proportional to acreage. Now, there's attorneys involved, and there may be other rights and things that I'm not privy to that would maybe modify that. I live in an overly simplistic world, which I was like, if I have 10 acres of land and 10 acre-feet of water, each one gets one. But that's, again, we're early in those conversations, and I know that there's all kinds of issues that have to be addressed. When it comes to our surface water supplies for the district that I represent, it will definitely be allocated proportional to acreage. And so if we have 10 acres and 10 acre-feet, every acre will get one. So I would hope and assume that we would manage the groundwater basin within our purview that same way, proportional.
So we're doing, as I mentioned, we're doing water budgets through our different areas in both the counties. So we're trying to figure out how do the surface water districts compare to groundwater pumper only, what's net put, net take, that type of thing, and do that. I think that when the question gets back to trying to allocate a certain yield or groundwater, like Eric was talking about, the question is going to be, well, you almost have to go, well, what's a natural condition? Trying to figure out what would happen absent surface water imports and everything else. So that's going to be a challenge. I mean, that's where I think some of the modeling will probably come in and help to get to a baseline, but I think that's probably the next step. I mean, in our mind, these water budgets, it's using, a lot of it's using satellite imagery, surface water budgets for districts who have all the records, putting that in. That's pretty easy to do. I think when you get into some of this modeling about what would happen if no surface water, what would be natural conditions, that's where the price tag goes up pretty quickly. And I'd say that's probably some of the work we do after we form our GSAs.
Did you have something else, Eric?
Yeah, I think that all comes down to, again, understanding the occurrence and distribution and circulation of the groundwater. Probably sort of a needs test, a demonstration of need. Fundamentally, you got to start with, well, how much is there, and what is the safe yield? And so, how do you then divvy up that pie is going to talk a lot of discussion. Is it first come, first served? Is it everybody's got an equal share? And you got to have, there's probably some adjudicated basin models that we could look at for methods and processes that were used. It's going to come down to understanding your water budget, having a good model at a local scale that can help you make those kinds of decisions. It's location dependent, right? And in some areas, there's going to be a higher yield than there are in other areas, which will have different drawdown effects, which then trigger different thresholds and different response mechanisms. That's all got to be part of the mix. It's all part of, true active management of the groundwater component of your water supply.
Thanks. Graham, so you have the mic. You have to be real fast, because I wanted to do a lightning round with these guys.
Okay, real quick. Just wanted to make sure everyone understands that there are deep benefits to recharge. The Central Valley, even though it's all confined aquifers essentially, all of that system is in pressure continuity on a time scale of days to months to years. So shallow recharge even benefits the deep confined aquifers, because that's ultimately where the water comes from.
Thanks. Okay, lightning round. You have up to 30 seconds. Greatest hope or greatest fear, or both if you can do them really fast.
Greatest fear is that somebody doesn't want to play and be fair and really work at creating these GSAs and making this work. They could trigger an adjudication and off we go to court. That's my greatest fear.
My greatest hope and my greatest fear is the Groundwater Sustainability Agency is actually formed by June of 2017. And that's my greatest fear as well.
Let's see, my greatest hope is my lotto numbers would hit and I'd get out of this mess. No, I would say greatest hope is, that we get our GSA formed and GSPs done, and that I'm still here as a manager. And then greatest fear is, I would say, the adjudication. I think that could just derail everything.
Greatest hope is that, for me, I don't see the GSAs, while they're an issue, I've commented that they're more of a sideshow. The real test for the basins will be the coordination of the groundwater sustainability plans. Clearly, we have many, many technical issues that we need to, A, get understanding or data to help inform decisions, but B, they're going to be very difficult to work through. So do I have a greatest? That was a fear, right?
That was a fear.
There's so many fears.
It's kind of like this.
Greatest hope is, no, it's another fear. I can say adjudication. I'm beat down. I have no hope right now.
Let's give these guys a big hand.